Going to share something a little different. I wanted to go in a different direction as we head into the new year, but I felt the Lord drew me right back to something I actually touched on last week, and I pray that this will be an encouragement to you. November the 9th, 1965. I don't know how many of you remember November the 9th, 1965. That night there were events that were set in motion that brought about one of the most difficult moments in the richest, most industrialized, most highly populated areas of the Western Hemisphere, which would be the eastern section of the northeast section of the United States as well as Canada. It brought this area to a standstill in 10 minutes. The time on November the 9th, 1965 was 5:16 p.m. And here's what happened. In Ontario, Canada, at the Sir Adam Beck Power Station, a backup relay switch was accidentally set too low by an operator, and it was not capable of handling the increased power transmission that was needed as the evening progressed. And because it was accidentally set too low, this relay switch, this one switch, tripped at 5:16 on November the 9th, 1965 in Ontario, Canada. The problem is that relay caused a power cancellation to begin to happen down the line from power station to power station. Because of the increasing pressure of the power as the night was coming on and the lights were turned on and the heat was turned up and all of those things, the pressure increased, but while the demand increased, the capability was decreased. And over down the line, minute after minute, these relay switches began to shut off. It's safety, shut off, to protect their circuits. And in less than 5 minutes, the entire northeastern part of the United States power grid went offline. Boom, done. And in the 10-minute window, New York City and all the surrounding areas, clear on up into Canada, were completely blacked out, no electricity available at all. The results were unimaginable. There was no power to provide heat or light to the citizens. The communication systems were down. There was no power to operate pumps. There was no way to move water or move the sewage or deliver the gas that was needed. Life support systems in hospitals were cut off. During that evening rush hour, 5 o'clock, an estimated 800,000 people were trapped in the subways in New York City. There were 150 hospitals affected, but only half of those had any type of emergency power available to them. And so the hospitals in that whole entire region were totally shut down and crippled because of the power outage. At John F. Kennedy Airport, 250 flights had to be diverted. With no light, no heat, no communications, 30 million people found themselves in the dark. And it was frightening. All because of the ripple effect set in motion by a small switch in a metal cup where the relay was that was set too low. Isn't that an incredible story? So here's the question I want to ask you this morning. What do you do when the lights go out? I read that story and I started to imagine myself in the subway, one of those hundreds of thousands of people trying to get home from work, and all of a sudden it goes dark. You know, like dark, like you can't see your hand in front of your face dark. Maybe there were emergency lights in the tunnels. I don't know how it was all set up back in 1965, but I know this. It would have been rather unnerving, to say the least. If my family was with me, I was thinking about this. If my family was with me, I would be trying to put on a strong, courageous face for my kids and say, it'll be okay. Just the lights are going to come back on. The lights are going to come back on. I don't know what you do when the power goes out. I know the power went out earlier this week for some in our congregation. But if you're like me, when the power goes out, I jump up. I go for the flashlight. I get downstairs and I pull the generator out. I basically want to take care of the situation and fix it and solve it and get the lights back on. Because I don't like to be in the dark unless I'm sleeping. But if I have to be alive and I have to be living and I have to be going about the duties of our life and family and all of that, I need the lights. I want to be able to see. I want to be able to know what's around the corner. I want it to be normal. But what do you do when the lights go out is an indication of what's going on in your life. Last week, I talked about our church. I talked about the past year. I talked a little bit about the pandemic and the challenges that we face. And I'm going to go a different direction, but I felt drawn to a passage of encouragement similar to the passage that I read to you last week. And the passage that I was drawn to today is John chapter 14. These are the words of Christ. If you have a Bible that has the red letters with the words of Christ, you'll notice that most of John chapter 14 are the actual words of Jesus Christ. Last week we talked about peace. We talked about all the things that happen in our world. Today I want to talk about peace again. I felt like the Lord would have us do this, but I want to talk about what happens when the lights go out and where you and I are personally with the idea of peace that comes from God. I want to read to you the beginning of John chapter 14, a couple of verses. Then I want to jump near the end and I want to read another couple of verses. And both of these verses, all of these verses, coincide together. Jesus says in John chapter 14, verse 1, he says, "Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you that I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and take you unto myself," or receive you unto myself, "that where I am, there ye may be also." I have read that passage in dozens and dozens of funerals. It is an encouragement. It is a great passage that talks about heaven. And I'm not going to talk about heaven necessarily this morning, but what really struck me as I was thinking about the world in which we live and what we are all facing, Jesus says right here at the beginning of this chapter, "Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe in me." But do you know that's not the only time he says, "Let not your hearts be troubled"? Jump down to verse number 27. This is also a familiar passage that has been read many times for encouragement. Jesus said, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. Not as the world gives do I give to you. Let not your hearts be troubled." There it is again. "Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid." Let me give you some context for this passage. Jesus is speaking to his disciples. He's not preaching on the hillside. He's not out talking to the multitudes. He's talking to his favorite people, his most intimate friends. And the disciples don't know it yet, but their lights are about ready to go out. Jesus he's talking in the upper room, and he's already eaten with his disciples. They've already eaten the Last Supper. We know it as the Last Supper. Jesus knew that it was the Last Supper, but his disciples didn't know it was the Last Supper. They didn't know what was going to happen next. Jesus, before he said, let not your hearts be troubled, Jesus has just prophesied about several things. He just prophesied that somebody was going to betray him. You remember reading about that earlier, the chapter before? And then after he said, one of you will betray me, Judas gets up and walks out to do his evil work. That just happened. Not only that, Jesus, before he says, let not your heart be troubled, Jesus looks at Peter and he says to him, before tomorrow morning, before the rooster crows in the morning, you're going to deny me not once or twice, but 3 times. And Peter's shocked and he's taken back, and no doubt he's looking around at his friends, the other disciples, and he's like, Jesus, would you rebuke me in front of them? Lord, no, I won't deny you. And Jesus nails it and he says, you will. Let me tell you something else that happened before Jesus said, let not your heart be troubled. Jesus had just finished washing the disciples' feet. That was a weird circumstance. That the teacher, the master, the rabbi, the person that they knew as the Messiah, he would stoop down and humble himself before them and wash their feet. They must have been stunned in that room. So can you imagine all the emotions that are happening in this upper room? They're eating with Jesus, and Jesus was just different than he normally was when they were eating. Jesus knew that this was the Last Supper. He knew what was getting ready to happen. The disciples didn't. And then Peter is rebuked by the Lord because he's going to deny him. And Judas is prophesied against, that he is going to betray him. And Jesus stoops down and he washes all of their feet. What an emotional roller coaster they must have been on. And then just before they leave, you can go to chapter 15, or the end of chapter 14, right before chapter 15, and Jesus said, let's go. And they went out into the garden, and that's where Jesus continued his teaching. But just before they left, Jesus looks at these men who have no idea what's getting ready to happen, and he says, let not your hearts be troubled. My peace I give to you, not as the world gives, but my peace I give unto you. Here's what I want you to know from this passage. Point number 1. Jesus knows that they are about ready to face troubling times. They don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. They don't know all the details of Jesus' crucifixion and then eventually his raising from the dead. They don't know all that, but Jesus knows that they are going to need to have heard these words echoing in their mind, let not your heart be troubled. He knows that discouragement is on its way. He knows that in a few moments their emotional roller coaster is going to get bigger than ever before. He knows that troubling times are just around the corner. And he says, let not your heart be troubled, neither let them be afraid. And I want you to know something this morning, and maybe you're joining us online, and maybe this is what this message is for you. I don't know. Not only did Jesus know that his disciples were getting ready to face troubling times, but Jesus knows exactly what's on your horizon. He knows what this year will hold. He knows what next year will bring. Jesus knows what's going to happen at work. Jesus knows what's going to happen at home. Everything that's on the horizon of your life and my life, be it encouraging or troubling, Jesus knows all about it. And it is so encouraging to me that just before the most emotional moments of the disciples' lives, when they watch their Lord being crucified, just before all that is about to happen, Jesus, who knows what's going to happen, he looks at his disciples with love and care and concern, and he says, hey, you're going to need this. Put this down. Write this in the notes on your phone. Do whatever you need to do. But remember to not let your heart be troubled. Jesus knows that they'll face troubling times. Let me give you something else from this passage. It's very clear. Jesus is saying The world does not know how to provide peace. Our world history, if you read the history books, which I enjoy doing from time to time, you'll know that there are times of peace and times of war. But here's what's interesting. You can go back through all of recorded history, and every single time there is peace, you can know this. You can take this to the bank. It won't last. It never does. In fact, the only way that the world knows how to get peace is one of two ways. Either we sign papers to try to bring peace, we call them treaties or agreements or whatever, or we fight wars. We sign agreements and papers that many times are broken even before the ink is dried on those papers. You name for me one treaty that's ever been signed in the history of our world that has been fully fulfilled and followed by all the countries involved to the point that there is complete peace. No. We don't keep our word. They don't keep their word. Treaties don't bring peace. So what do? We fight wars. How many global conflicts has our world gone through? I mean, we know about World War I and World War II, but go back in history. There were global conflicts long before we started calling them world wars. There were dictators who began to conquer the world. This has happened multiple times throughout history. And so finally, somebody is victorious, somebody wins the battle, somebody wins the war, and guess what? Peace finally comes to the land. It's not lasting. Peace only happens because somebody was vanquished. The stronger outsmarted the weaker, and now their strength is going to bring peace. But it doesn't last. World War I was between the years of 1914 and 1918. Just 29 years later, World War II started. And by the way, I can't remember if I mentioned this last week or not. I talked about 2022 and World War II, and hopefully 2022 is not a repeat or a worse repeat of 2020. We talked about that last week. But during World War II, you know what they called it? They didn't call it World War I. That would be very depressing. This is World War I, folks, because World War II is coming. No, they didn't call it World War I. They called it the Great War because they had never seen anything like this. And the estimates are that almost 65 million people across the world lost their life because of World War I. We don't even think about World War I. Why? Because almost 85 million people lost their life in World War II. This is globally. This is including Soviet Union and China and everything else. So think about this. World War I is really hardly even studied at times because World War II was so much greater than World War I. It'd be like us right now calling this COVID pandemic. This is COVID-1. Isn't that depressing? COVID-2 is on its way. And COVID-3 and COVID-4. Like, oh no, that's terrible. Listen, our world has proven over and over again down through history, we can't get it right. As much as we try to bring peace and much as we try to bring prosperity, and thankfully at this stage in our nation's history, we do have relative peace. But the truth is, the conflict is just around the corner. And the world does not know how to provide peace. And Jesus says, hey, the peace I'm talking about is not the peace that the world gives. It's different. It's the peace that I give. Which leads me to point number 3. True peace can only come from God, period. It can't come from a war. It can't come from fighting. It can't come from a paper or a treaty. True peace only comes from the person of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Jesus said right here, he said, you don't have to earn it. It's not something you have to achieve. It's not something you have to scramble. He just says, I'm going to give it to you. Disciples, you don't know what's getting ready to happen. You don't know how emotional life is going to be tomorrow. But today, I just want you to know, I have peace I'm going to give you. And you don't have to buy it. You don't have to earn it. It's just going to be yours. All you have to do is just trust me. My peace I give to you. Not as the world gives, but my peace I give to you. Excuse me. Think about what's happening right now in this story. Jesus is speaking these words, and as he is telling them, I'm going to give you peace, he knows what's coming. Jesus knows that he's going to be betrayed. He knows that he's going to go on trial that night. He knows that he's going to be beaten, excruciatingly so. Jesus knows what was coming next. He knows that he's going to be falsely accused. He knows that he's going to stand before Pilate. He knows that he's going to be placed in front of a crowd, and the entire crowd is going to scream at him and call for his death. And Jesus knows that he's going to walk up that lonely hill to Golgotha, and he knows he's going to lay down on a cross and be nailed to that cross. And that cross is going to be stood up, and he knows he's going to be crucified, and he knows that his side is going to be pierced, and he knows that he's going to die. And in the midst of all of this knowledge, in this moment, Jesus looks at these precious disciples who have laid their life on the line for him, who have followed him and trusted him, and he says to them, let not your heart be troubled. My peace I give to you. Basically, the peace that Jesus was giving to his disciples and what he wants to give to all of us, his followers, is the same peace that allowed him to face the crucifixion that he knew was coming because he knew it was the will of the Father. It's the peace that allowed Jesus, without fighting or getting angry or getting emotional, to stand in front of that crowd and listen as they yell, crucify him. And he could stand there in peace. And as he bent over that whipping block and those soldiers just flogged his body with those, they called it a cat of nine tails, and the bits of glass and shards of bone and all of that stuff. And they just ripped his back and made him a bloody mess for him to just stay there and take it. When he could have stopped everything if he wanted to. But to stay there in that moment has to come from a deep, settled peace that no matter what is happening, this is a part of God's plan. What peace? What incredible peace Jesus has. And he wants to give that incredible peace to you and to me. This is his final conversation. And in this moment, he's not thinking of himself and what he has to do. He's thinking of his disciples and how this is going to affect them. And he's also thinking of you and I today in the midst of the world in which we live, in the midst of the circumstances that we're under. He is telling us, hey, if you want peace, you're not going to find it in politics. You're not going to find it in wars. You're not going to find it in treaties. You are going to find peace in me. And I'm going to give it to you. Point number one, Jesus knows they'll face troubling times, and he knows you'll face troubling times. Point number two, the world in which we live does not know how to provide peace. Point number three, true peace can only come from the person of Jesus Christ. And let me tell you one more. This is found right here in this passage. Peace doesn't reside on the outside. Peace resides on the inside. Jesus looks at them and he says, don't let your heart be troubled. He was speaking directly to the core of their being. He's telling them, listen, Whatever happens around you, whatever the emotions that are going on in your mind and in your thoughts, listen, guard your heart. Keep your heart. Don't let your heart be troubled. I'm going to give you peace that only you can understand in your heart when you trust in me. I remember hearing a story that Tim Keep told. I think it was Tim Keep. It was about his son, Jesse. They're missionaries to the Philippines, or they were. And Jesse, as you probably remember, some of you heard that story, how he got cancer in his eye and was blinded in both eyes. And they were sitting at the dinner table one evening, having supper as a family. And they're in the Philippines, and of course it's another country, and all of a sudden the lights went out. Electricity went off. And it was at night, and it was dark, and all of a sudden everything went dark. The lights went out, everything. And immediately, Tim Keep said his family just started scrambling around. I mean, his wife went for a candle, and he went to find a flashlight, and all of a sudden, everybody at this table, all their family, they got up and they're feeling their way around. They're trying to get a light or a candle or a lamp or whatever. Why? Because they're eating, and the lights go out, and they're scrambling. Except for Jesse. He just kept on eating. And he's eating, enjoying his meal, while everybody else is just like having an emotional basket case because the electricities went out. And all of a sudden, he starts laughing and making fun of them. It's like, what's y'all's problem? What, you need lights to eat? Come on now. And he's just sitting there having dinner while everybody around him is swirling with emotion and panic and all the things that happen when the lights go out. Jesse's blind. He's not affected by what we can see because he can't see it. And when the lights went out on the Keep family in the Philippines, Jesse wasn't affected at all. In fact, Tim told me some other stories of how Jesse would want to go out and play at 11 o'clock at night. All the other kids are home, getting tucked in, and Jesse wants to go out and ride a bike, which he did. He had a little cement pad. I've been over there at the campus, and he would learn how to stay on that pad. It was a pathway from different buildings on the campus, and he could ride a bike whether it was 1 o'clock in the morning or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Didn't matter. He couldn't see either way. When you and I really understand what Jesus is saying right here, we will stop scrambling when the lights go out. We'll stop trying to fix things when our world becomes unraveled. And instead, maybe, while everybody else is going nuts, we'll step back. We'll say, okay, God, what are you working on now? Okay, God, how are you accomplishing your will in this moment? Listen, these words that Jesus spoke to his disciples so many years ago, let not your heart be troubled, those are promises for us too. The peace that Jesus wants to give his disciples, that's a promise for us today. And when Jesus said, hey, my peace I'm going to give to you, it's not going to be like the world gives. It's going to be lasting peace. That is a word for you and I today. This is the same Jesus. I just want you to know who's saying this. This is the same Jesus who knows how to sleep in the middle of a storm. You remember that story in Mark chapter 4? A great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, and the boat was filling up with water. But Jesus was in the stern of the boat asleep on a pillow. You can read it, Mark chapter 4. And his disciples woke him up, and they said, Teacher, Rabbi, don't you care that we're about to perish? And Jesus is sleeping. And he wakes up and he looks around, and do you know what the first word out of his mouth was? He said, peace. Be still. And we think that he's talking to the wind and the waves, and he was, and the wind and the waves immediately stopped. But I also think he was talking to his disciples. They're scurrying around the boat. They got the buckets. They're pulling, dumping the water out of the boat, and they're panicked, and they're about to lose their life. And Jesus says, peace. Hey, guys, be still. God's in control. Peace. That's the Jesus who told his disciples right before he went to the cross, hey, I'm going to give you my peace. Let not your heart be troubled. It's the same Jesus who also said these words in Matthew chapter 19, verse 26. He said, with man, this is impossible, but with God, all things are possible. Jesus, who can calm the wind and the rain. Jesus, who told his disciples before he went to the cross, hey, you don't know what's coming, but don't let your hearts be troubled. That same Jesus is telling us all things are possible with God. If it is his will, it will happen. If it is according to God's plan, it will be accomplished. The Apostle Paul said it this way in Romans chapter 8, verse 28. He said, and we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. If you put your faith in Jesus Christ, you will have peace that passes all understanding, that the world won't understand, the people in charge won't understand, the people around you who are scurrying trying to turn the lights back on, they won't understand. But God can give you peace in the midst of a storm. And it may be dark right now, but don't ever forget that Jesus is the light of the world. And you may be hanging on for dear life in the middle of a storm that is rocking your boat. Can I just remind you that Jesus can calm every single storm? You might be facing the most discouraging moment of your life. But right now, Jesus is speaking peace to you. And he's saying, hey, don't let your heart be troubled. Someone said this, safety consists not in the absence of danger, but in the very presence of God. Safety is not things just going along smoothly. Safety is knowing that God has got it all under control. You know, people want peace today. They work hard for peace. People will save and plan and work their fingers to the bone so that they can have peace in their retirement. People will vote for peace. They'll march for peace. They'll hold up signs for peace. They'll fight for peace. Some people will even die for peace. I'm grateful for those that have defended our country. But listen, until we surrender to Jesus Christ, we will not know what true peace really is. Charles Wesley penned these words so many years ago. He said, I rest beneath the Almighty's shade. My griefs expire and my troubles cease. Thou, O Lord, on whom my soul is stayed, will keep me still in perfect peace. Last week I read from Isaiah chapter 26, verse 3. Thou wilt keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on thee, because he trusteth in thee. I was planning to go another direction with my message this morning, but I felt drawn all the way back to talk about peace. Not as the world gives, not because of a paper signed at the end of a global conflict, but peace that comes from the hand of the Father and centers itself in our very hearts. That kind of peace. The peace that can help you walk through a difficult time, that can help you weather the most difficult storm. Lasting peace from the hand of the Father. Let's stand together this morning. I want you to bow your heads and close your eyes for just a moment. If you're watching online, I I would encourage you just to take a moment as well. You might be in your living room or your office or wherever. Your heart today. That doesn't come from what's going on around you. Peace that causes you to be totally calm in the midst of a difficult circumstance. Peace that helps you not to panic even when the lights go out. Peace. 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 If you don't have peace, or if there is a trouble in your spirit, or if there's something that's swirling in your emotions and you just don't know what to do with it, listen, all you have to do is give it to God. Whatever's troubling you, whatever worries you, whatever's keeping you up at night, whatever you are uncertain about in the future, just give it to the Lord. And He will take it, and in exchange, He will give you His peace as you put your faith and trust in Him. Let's pray together. And if you don't have peace, you can ask Him for it right now. Dear God, we thank you so much for this story today. This account of you in the upper room and these words that you said thousands of years ago that still resonate with us today. Oh Lord, we need peace in our times, and we need peace in our hearts. Lord, I pray for every person here today. If they're troubled, Lord, may they just give those insecurities, those worries, those struggles to you, and I pray you would bless them with peace. Lord, if there's someone here today who's trying to figure out life on their own and solve their own problems and bring their own peace, Lord, help them just to quit. Help them to surrender to you. Lord, even now in this moment, I pray that they would just confess to you that they can't do it anymore. And I pray that you would flood them with your peace. Lord, if there's someone that's running from you today, I pray that they would stop and turn to you and give their heart and life to you. Lord, if there's someone today who is just overwhelmed by the burden of the world in which we live or the struggles that they are facing, Lord, I pray that you would give them healing and help today, and they would surrender those worries to you, and that you would give them peace. Lord, I thank you for the fact that you are in control and that you are moving and working, and this is a reminder for us today. Lord, we put our faith and our trust in you, and we are grateful for your peace in our life. May your name be glorified in everything that we do. We praise you in Jesus' name. Amen.